Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
My wife and I had been planning our delayed honeymoon for months. We got married in 2020 during the height of the coronavirus pandemic, which meant our wedding was small and intimate, just immediate family. No big celebration, no fancy reception, and definitely no honeymoon. I had recently started a new job as a software developer, which meant I hadn't accumulated much vacation time. But with my wife being 6 months pregnant, we knew this would be our last chance to travel, just the two of us, before our daughter arrived. After careful consideration and research about coronavirus safety protocols, we decided on Iceland. It seemed perfect. Outdoor activities, natural wonders, and most importantly, very few COVID cases. So here we were in August 2021, exploring the remote eastern part of Iceland. We had rented a car and were following the Ring Road, the main highway that circles the entire island. The landscape was breathtaking. Volcanic rocks, green moss, and the occasional sheep dotting the hillsides. We stopped at this small shopping center, mainly because my wife needed to use the restroom. Pregnancy bladder, you know? While waiting, I decided to browse through their selection of traditional Icelandic wool products. A particular hoodie caught my eye, thick, warm, and perfect for the chilly weather. Now, let me paint you a picture. I'm a black man in arguably the whitest country I've ever visited. I was wearing a beanie, a plain black t-shirt, some comfortable joggers, and hiking boots. Typical tourist attire. Meanwhile, every single employee in the store wore the same uniform, a bright blue polo shirt with the store's logo and a clearly visible name badge. I was examining the price tag on the hoodie when I heard someone behind me. An American woman asked if I had this one hoodie in a darker color in the back. I ignored her, assuming she was talking to someone else. She tapped my shoulder and repeated her question. I responded with a sarcastic question, asking if I really looked like I worked there. Her face turned red, but not from embarrassment. She became indignant, telling me off for speaking to her that way when she was just asking a simple question. I tried explaining that I was clearly a tourist, just like her, and pointed out that every actual employee was wearing a bright blue uniform with a name tag, while I was wearing a beanie and joggers. She retorted with a half-formed excuse about thinking I was stocking shelves or something. I called her out directly, asking if she assumed the only black person in the entire building must be working there, in Iceland of all places. By this point, my wife had returned and was watching the scene unfold. The American woman's husband, who had been browsing nearby, rushed over to do damage control. He tried to defuse the situation by telling his wife that I didn't work there and suggesting they look somewhere else. But the woman wasn't having it. She demanded to speak to the manager about my attitude. An actual employee who had been watching this interaction approached us and asked if everything was okay. The woman immediately complained that I had been extremely rude to her when she simply asked for help. I explained that I was rude because she had made assumptions about me based on my appearance, leaving the obvious implication hanging in the air. The employee explained to them that I was a customer, not an employee, and pointed out that all their staff wore uniforms. Instead of apologizing, the woman grabbed her husband's arm and stormed out, muttering under her breath about people being too sensitive these days. My wife squeezed my hand and suggested we buy the hoodie just to spite the woman. So I did. And you know what? Every time I wear that hoodie, which turns out to be incredibly warm and comfortable, I think about that woman and hope she learned something that day. Though, given her reaction, I somehow doubt it. The rest of our Iceland trip was spectacular, filled with waterfalls, geothermal springs, and the midnight sun. But this incident stands out as a reminder that some people will carry their prejudices even to the most remote parts of the world. At least I got a good story and a great hoodie out of it. I never imagined I'd face something like this after buying my dream house. After working as a mechanic and saving for 15 years, I finally bought a beautiful colonial-style home from the 1890s. The previous owner, an elderly woman who lived there for over 40 years, was glad to sell it to someone who would care for it. I spent the first 6 months renovating the place. The house needed a lot of work, but I enjoyed every minute of it. The yard was my pride and joy. I planted a vegetable garden, added some flowering shrubs, and even put in a small pond. It was perfect until that crazy woman showed up. I was working from home that day, fixing up an old motorcycle in my garage, when I heard strange noises coming from my backyard. At first I thought it might be an animal, but then I heard what sounded like digging. There was this woman, probably in her 50s, wearing expensive-looking clothes that were now covered in dirt, frantically digging holes all over my perfectly maintained yard. She had already destroyed my vegetable garden and was working her way toward my pond. I yelled out, asking her what the hell she thought she was doing. She barely looked up from her digging and just kept going like a woman possessed. She told me this was her family's property and that her great-grandfather had buried a valuable family heirloom here in 1923, and she was getting it back. I told her that she was trespassing and that this was my property, which I had bought legally 6 months ago. She wouldn't listen and insisted that this land belonged to her family before my house was even built, claiming she had every right to be here. I told her this was ridiculous and that I had documentation of every owner since the 1890s when the house was built, so her story made no sense. She got really angry then, demanding to know if I was calling her a liar. She started bragging about how her family practically built this town. She was becoming more agitated, her face turning red as she gripped the shovel tighter. I pulled out my phone and told her I was calling the police. She threatened to sue me for everything I had, still insisting it was her family's treasure. I gave her a 1-minute warning to get off my property before I made the call. Instead of leaving, she started digging even more frantically, destroying what was left of my garden. When I started dialing, she completely lost it. She screamed that she wasn't leaving without her family's treasure and swung the shovel at me with surprising force. I managed to duck just in time as it whizzed past my head and clattered against the side of the house. That's when I hit call on my phone. The police arrived within minutes. By then she was sitting in one of the holes she'd dug, crying and screaming about her family's legacy. It turned out she lived in the next town over and had been going around doing this to other properties as well. She had some sort of mental break after finding old documents that supposedly proved her family once owned large portions of land in the area. The police arrested her for trespassing, vandalism, and assault with a deadly weapon. But the story doesn't end there. During her court appearance, her attorney tried to claim temporary insanity, but then the prosecutor revealed something interesting. They had searched her house and found detailed maps of several properties in the area, along with a collection of antique items that matched descriptions of things that had been reported stolen from other historical homes in the region. She wasn't just having a mental break, she was running a scam. She would research old properties, make up stories about family connections, and then use that as an excuse to search for valuable antiques she could steal and sell. She had already successfully pulled this off at 3 other historical homes. The judge wasn't amused. She got 3 years in prison and was ordered to pay restitution to all her victims, including the cost of completely restoring my yard. I used that money to install security cameras and a better fence, just in case any of her relatives decide to come looking for more family heirlooms. After years of working in various restaurants across Texas, I found myself taking a position as a maitre d' at the Victory Club in Piedras Negras. The pay was decent, and the atmosphere was usually pleasant. That is, until that fateful night in 1943. I had developed my skills in the restaurant industry from the ground up, starting as a dishwasher when I was just 16. Through determination and a natural talent for customer service, I worked my way up to more prestigious positions. When the opportunity came to work at the Victory Club, I jumped at it. The club was popular with both locals and Americans, particularly military personnel from the nearby base. That night we were just about to close up. The kitchen staff had already cleaned everything and gone home when they burst in. A group of military wives, all dressed up and demanding to be served. There were about 8 of them, and from the moment they walked in, I could tell they were going to be trouble. One of them, who I'll call Karen since that's what we call entitled women these days, walked straight up to my podium. She immediately demanded a table and food, making it clear they wanted lots of it. When I apologetically explained that our kitchen was closed for the night, she became indignant. She demanded to know if I knew who they were, explaining that their husbands were officers at the base and that we couldn't turn them away. When I tried to explain about the kitchen staff having left, another wife cut in to tell me how unacceptable this was, complaining about their long drive from the base. Karen then threw in that her husband was a colonel and started making veiled threats about what would happen when he heard about this. I quickly told them I would see what I could do, hoping to defuse the situation. I knew they weren't going to leave without causing a scene. These types of wives were notorious in the area. They believed their husbands' military ranks somehow entitled them to special treatment everywhere they went. I hurried to the kitchen, desperately searching for anything I could serve them. The stoves were cold, and most of the ingredients were either put away or locked up. Then I spotted some leftover tortillas, a block of cheese, and some jalapeno peppers. It wasn't much, but I had to work with what I had. While I was preparing something, I could hear them in the dining room. Karen was loudly complaining about the treatment, saying this would never happen in America. Another wife suggested writing to the base commander about the establishment, while a third one made a condescending remark about how local establishments needed to learn their place, claiming her husband had said so. I quickly cut the tortillas into triangles, shredded the cheese over them, and added sliced peppers. After heating everything until the cheese melted, I arranged it on our finest serving platter. It wasn't exactly standard menu fare, but I hoped it would satisfy them. When I brought out the dish, Karen immediately started complaining, demanding to know what it was supposed to be. I smoothly replied that it was a special dish we prepared for our most distinguished guests, calling it a local delicacy. I was laying it on thick, but I needed to save the situation. To my surprise, one of the wives tried a piece and exclaimed with delight about how good it was. The others started trying it, and soon they were all eating enthusiastically. Even Karen seemed to forget her earlier attitude, though she still managed to add a snippy comment about expecting the kitchen to be open next time. I assured her with practiced politeness that we were honored to serve them. What happened next was unexpected. When they were leaving, one of the quieter wives in the group came back to the podium. She apologized for the others' behavior, admitting they could be a bit much but praised the food, asking what it was called. I hadn't thought of a name, but since I had prepared it, I told her they were special nachos. She expressed her approval of the name and mentioned that the Base Wives Club would definitely be hearing about them. And they did. Word spread about the dish I created that night, first around the base, then throughout the region. Soon, other restaurants started making their own versions. It became so popular that reporters eventually tracked me down to interview me about that night. Sometimes I think about those entitled wives and how their demanding behavior accidentally led to the creation of one of the most popular snacks in the world. I never saw that specific group again, but years later, I heard that Karen had tried to take credit for discovering nachos at some military wives' function. Apparently, nobody believed her because by then, the true story had already been published in several newspapers. The Victory Club became famous for its nachos, and I went on to open my own restaurant. Every time I see someone enjoying a plate of nachos, I think about that night and how something good came out of dealing with such entitled behavior. I still serve them the exact same way I did that first night. Simple, fresh, and without any pretense. I've always been proud of my French-Canadian heritage, even though I moved to Vancouver 5 years ago for work. Growing up bilingual in Montreal gave me a unique perspective on life, and I've lost count of how many times my language skills have come in handy in the corporate world. But never did I imagine they'd serve me quite like they did last week. I recently moved into this gorgeous 50-floor high-rise in downtown Vancouver. The rent is steep, but the view of the harbor makes up for it, and I absolutely love going for runs along the waterfront during sunset. It helps clear my mind after spending hours hunched over my tablet, working on client projects. That one evening, I was returning from my usual run, feeling accomplished after hitting my personal best time. My face was probably still flushed from the exercise, and my ponytail was a mess, but I felt great. As I approached the building's entrance, a family was walking in just ahead of me. The father, dressed in what looked like casual wear, held the door open. I gave them a quick thank you as we all headed toward the elevators. It was a couple with 3 boys, all around elementary school age. They were dressed like tourists, with matching backpacks and those distinctive "I'm on vacation" vibes. The kids were bouncing around with leftover energy from what I assumed was a day of sightseeing, chattering away in French. We all ended up in the same elevator. I pressed the button for the 35th floor while the father reached for a higher number. The elevator began its climb, and that's when things got interesting. The father asked his children in French whether they thought I was pretty or not pretty. My ears perked up immediately. I kept my eyes forward, maintaining my poker face. One of the kids quickly responded in French, declaring that I wasn't pretty. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I've always been secure in my appearance, but something about being judged so blatantly, especially in front of children, made my blood boil. The father didn't even attempt to correct his child's behavior. Instead, he chuckled, encouraging the others to join in. The second child eagerly agreed, emphasizing that I wasn't pretty at all. The third one chimed in, pointing out how red my face was. They were now commenting on my flushed appearance, and the father was doing nothing to stop it. The mother stood there silently, staring at her phone, pretending not to hear anything. Her passive acceptance of the situation somehow made it even worse. The elevator continued its upward journey, and with each passing floor, I felt my initial shock turning into determination. I'm usually the type to avoid confrontation, preferring to let things slide to keep the peace. But something about this situation, maybe it was the father's arrogance in assuming I wouldn't understand, or the way he was teaching his children it was okay to judge strangers, made me decide enough was enough. The father then made a snide comment about how it looked like I had just come from the gym, but suggested it clearly wasn't helping much. That last remark was the final straw. I watched the floor numbers tick by, formulating my response. I wanted something that would make an impact but wouldn't stoop to their level. Finally, the elevator reached my floor. I stepped forward, then turned around to face them fully. I made sure to look directly at the father as I spoke. In my most perfect French, with my Montreal accent on full display, I wished them a good evening and suggested that perhaps next time they could teach their children that it's not polite to judge strangers, as that would be a much better example. The father's face went through about 5 different shades of red in 2 seconds flat. The kids' mouths dropped open in perfect synchronization, and even the mother finally looked up from her phone, her eyes wide with embarrassment. The father could only stammer incoherently, unable to form a proper response. But before he could gather his thoughts, I stepped out of the elevator with my head held high. As the doors were closing, I heard one of the kids exclaim in shock to their father, reminding him that he had told them nobody in Vancouver speaks French. The doors shut on the father trying to explain to his kid why he'd lied about that. I couldn't help but laugh as I walked to my apartment, imagining them spending the rest of their vacation paranoid about who else might understand their conversations. I never saw them again. They were probably staying in one of the many Airbnbs in the building, but I like to think they learned something that day. Not just about making assumptions about strangers, but about teaching children to be kind. And I got my perfect secret bilingual moment, and it was even better than I'd imagined. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.